Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Dill, an opportunity for the fellas to call our shot a little bit as the college football playoff conversation, starts to open up as we're halfway through the 2024 season. We got four teams that we think are kind of sneaky contenders, dark horse contenders, if you will, to be in that conversation come the end of November as college football playoff teams. And we're going to talk about four teams and the reasons for them being dark horses are a little bit different for each team. I mean, there are a couple teams that we're going to talk about that we just think are some of the better teams that we see in the country. But I think more importantly, there are a few teams that we're going to talk about that they might not be a top 12 team in the country as we sit, but they got a pathway in terms of how their schedule shakes out the back half of the season to get themselves in that conversation, fired up to get into it. Now, before we do, and as always, I think most importantly, like throw some teams down there. Everybody gets the opportunity to call their shot in the comment section, whether you think the boys are way off with these four teams, whether we're sleeping on a team that could be a dark horse candidate. Let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate y'all rocking with it. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And Dill, without further ado, let's get into it. And let's start with this Nebraska team. And for me, when I look at Nebraska, it's a combination. Like, I like what's under the hood with Nebraska. I think Rhule is fundamentally changed this offense, but I think more importantly, you're starting to see this defense come alive. You're sitting at 5-1 heading into the bye week, coming off a win against Rutgers, who was an undefeated team up until that point. And although Rhule didn't have his best game against Rutgers, 20-mile-per-hour winds, a Rutgers team that under Greg Schiano is just going to drag you into the mud pretty much every single time you play them. I think more importantly, you're sitting here and saying, this is a gettable schedule. You go on the road at Indiana coming off a bye week. So I think that certainly helps Nebraska. But more importantly, like, what is Indiana? They've looked really good, but they haven't really played anybody on their schedule. I'll just put my hand up and say, I don't even know what to think about that football game or that football team right now. But if you can get by Indiana and then you go on the road at Ohio State, where you probably drop that one, at least how I look at it right now, I think there's a legitimate chance that Nebraska can run the rest of the table, finish 10-2, and kind of how you're looking at it, a 10-2 team in the Big Ten. I think there's a very good chance that you're in that conversation for a college football playoff appearance, considering that one, I think the Big 12 just ain't they're getting their conference champion in, and that's about it. But I think more importantly, you look at the ACC and say, all right, Miami, Clemson, I think those are the only two teams, potentially another dark horse that we're going to talk about. And then the SEC just seems to be cannibalizing each other.
Yeah, and I think I think there's a really good chance the Big Ten gets four. And for them to get in, that is Nebraska, or even in Illinois, I think they could probably be on as a dark horse team. They really only have to play Michigan and Oregon left on that schedule of teams that I think really, really would challenge them. And I'm not even trying to put Michigan in that category. So I think the Big Ten has a really good chance to get four. You kind of have your top three locked up with Oregon, State, and Ohio State. But then you look, Michigan and USC have kind of fallen off. Don't think they have a great shot. So I think that fourth team, especially if the SEC trend of kind of what you said, cannibalizing itself kind of continues, I think you get a really, really good shot to get four in. And if they do get to that 10-2 mark, that's probably the second or the fourth team, I guess, if you will.
And I think the more like the important conversations, like they're going to be hot to end the season. Why I think Nebraska is a fascinating team to talk about is you look at that game. If you can get by Indiana, you're looking at that USC game. You're going on the road halfway across the country. Two things that I love. One, you're coming off a bye. But I think more importantly, you look at USC and how they're constructed right now. Dale, I'll say this. I have a ton of question marks about how USC is going to block up Nebraska's defensive line. That's where USC is struggling. When they see good defensive fronts, they are struggling in a meaningful way. But I think on top of that, this USC team is not very deep. If you wanted to play USC, you probably wanted to play them at the end of the season, because I look at that defensive line, you're already seeing the depth concerns kind of come to life. If they lose a guy, and I hope they don't, but Clifton or Gavin Mayer, they're thin on the defensive line. I think a lot of USC fans would probably admit that too.
But even just the attrition of playing as much football as those guys are playing, I mean, given that they don't have guys beyond that first unit, especially in the interior, those guys are playing like 40, 50 snaps a game, it feels like. And that's just it's a lot of snaps to play for anyone. It was a lot of snaps for the guys in Nebraska last year, so they know firsthand what playing that much will do to you and how much, difference maybe you look versus week 2 versus week 10. So
so you look at that game and say, that I think that's a good matchup for Nebraska. I love everything about that matchup coming off a bye, end of season, besides playing at USC. I'd rather have that game in Lincoln if you're Nebraska. That being said, like there's a lot of reasons to believe that that's a very good matchup for Nebraska. You get by that, you all know how I feel about the Iowa Hawkeyes. I think there's a very good chance Nebraska finishes at 10-2, and then you're probably right. It kind of depends on like what does Illinois look like and what are they doing the back half of the season, because you obviously don't have that head-to-head win. A 10-2 Nebraska, they're at least going to be in the conversation. But I think more importantly, if they are 10-2, they're probably coming off 4 consecutive wins, 2 of which I think will be pretty impressive on the resume. Fire me up for Nebraska being in that conversation. Dill, second team, and this is more of a team that I think we both share the idea that this is just maybe a top 12 team in the country. They've won 5 straight. I think the bigger storyline is 2 things. One, Connor Wigman. If we get that version of Connor Wigman for the rest of the 2024 season, this Texas A&M team is extremely dangerous. I think more importantly, you're starting to see that front seven for Texas A&M, that elite front seven that we had. They're starting to come to life. And then you look at the schedule and say you're also going into a bye week this week. And then you look at the back half and say, I got to pull it up here. You go on the road at Mississippi State. I don't care where you play Mississippi State. You play them on Mars. You're winning that football game. They are not very good. LSU's at home. You love that. On the road at South Carolina, you're kind of circling LSU and Texas. Like if they're a top 12 team, you should probably be beating South Carolina, New Mexico State, and Auburn.
Especially with the way South Carolina matches up. I mean, there's teams
they can't block them.
South Carolina be a problem for, but teams with really elite defensive lines, I do not think South Carolina is good against.
Yeah, that's you love that matchup. And I think the conversation you're going to have is if you can just win 1 out of 2 against LSU and Texas, in which you both get at home, it's going to be a rowdy environment the way Texas A&M is playing. I like your chances I like your chances to win one of those 2 games. And so if you're Texas A&M, not only do you have a team that I think is legitimately a top 12 team in the country, the way they just played against Missouri, I think more importantly, what the pathway looks like. Again, they'll 10-2 team in the SEC. Like you're going to be in that conversation at the end of November to make the college football playoffs here.
Yeah, and they gotta. I mean, I think it will really come down to LSU because I mean, I like Texas A&M for sure. Texas is a tough.
That's a tough matchup because for the same reasons you just said about South Carolina, like I do think Texas has the chance at blocking Texas A&M up. So, like, I look at that game and say, all right, Texas probably matches up all right against Texas A&M.
But also, Texas just, like, kind of at a different level in college football. I'm not saying, like, Texas A&M won't be there at some point under Elko, but what Sarkisian's built in Texas with that quarterback, with those offensive weapons and the offensive line, that's a hammer of a squad. So, that LSU game to me feels like that's the one I think you really, really want to get.
Agreed. Now, let's go to a team that nobody's going to be talking about. This straight up might just be a spicy take from the boys, but here's out. Give us 3 minutes here. SMU. There's a couple of things about SMU that I think are intriguing. One, you're coming off a road win against Louisville, who is a top 25 team in the country. You made a switch at quarterback to Kevin Jennings, and you made that switch after the loss at BYU. You put up 66 against TCU, put up 42 against Florida State, you put up 34 against Louisville. This offense is clearly starting to click with the quarterback change. But I think more importantly, like Dill, this is one of those examples, like, do I think SMU is a top 12 team in the country? No, probably not. They're going into a bye week. Where's the loss on the schedule, Dill? Like at Stanford, certainly winnable. I know that's always a hard place to play because it's sleepy. At Duke, I don't think Duke's very good. Pitt's one of those teams like Indiana where I'm trying to figure it out. Off week, Boston College, at Virginia, Cal. Dill, where's the loss? And you can look at SMU and say you finish 11-1, you make the ACC championship game, regardless if you win or lose that football game. I think the question would be, do you have enough quality wins to lose that ACC championship game and still get into the college football playoffs? But the way I look at it, there's a very good chance that this SMU team is sitting there 11-1 at the end of November here.
And then we're going to get to a real interesting conversation because I'm kind of with you. It almost feels like there's a very good chance. Not to say like, again, if I was putting a line out on it, they're probably underdogs to win all these games just because I'm not sure they're that type of team. But they're
probably favorites in every single one of these football games.
That's kind of like individually, they should win every single one. So again, is there room for an upset? Yeah, probably there is room for that. But if they do win out, let's say, I think then you're going to see a really interesting conversation with whoever doesn't get in, whether it's Miami or Clemson.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be a hot one because I'm going to look, frankly, and I know I'm going to be that guy. I'm going to look at the end of the year, be like, oh, I'd probably take both those two teams. So whoever wins that matchup, the Miami Clemson matchup.
Well,
Yeah.
that's they don't play. So like the fascinating conversation is
Well, then it gets
like
real.
yeah, 100%. It's gonna be kind of a gong show in the ACC, and I'm kind of with you right now with how bad Florida State's been. It's hard for me to see 3 ACC teams getting into the college football playoffs, and we know how the college football playoff committee operates. Like they're gonna
Even teams like Virginia Tech. I mean, there's just not enough good wins. Like Virginia Tech has
agreed.
NC State looks terrible compared to it. Like the ACC on the surface, but I would have probably thought 3 going into the
Man,
year have a good shot. But like their out of conference have been brutal.
if Louisville, it's crazy to say if Louisville won that game against Notre Dame, like maybe the outlook around the ACC is a little bit different. It's the ACC is going to be tricky because I think there's going to be maybe 3 teams, Clemson, Miami, and SMU, that have records that maybe should say they should be in the college football playoffs. But then is it good enough? Do you have enough for the resume? Do you have enough quality wins to kind of edge out in that conversation? We'll see how the committee approaches that. I got a feeling that they're going to give and I'm not even gonna say it's the wrong thing because you do look at the ACC and say it ain't that good of a conference with how bad Florida State's been. The last team, this is your team. I do not condone this, but sell us on Missouri potentially making the college football
I
playoffs.
mean, it just comes down to not being ready to abandon ship on Missouri. I still look like roster. And I don't think their schedule's brutal. They have Alabama, they have Oklahoma. I think the Alabama game's certainly tough, but I'm not sure Alabama's unbeatable. I don't love what they're doing on the defensive side of the ball. But I also look, when we talk about these dark horse teams, if you line me up with all 3 of them, I think Missouri is an infinitely better team. I think they're more complete. I think they're better. Again, are they playing that way? No, that's the problem fundamentally is you look at Missouri's roster and say, well, this isn't a team that should be going to overtime with Vanderbilt and playing a close one with BC for a half of football and all. Like everything they've been doing that makes me very suspect of
Yeah,
the operation. But it's a really, really good roster, and they have the quarterback offensive line combo in wide receivers that I think they can score on anyone.
that's the conversation you have with Missouri is like, can you just get this roster playing like it's
On the
on
left
paper?
side of the offensive line needs to tighten up. Like that's too talented of a group of guys, Caden Green and Brian. Like those are good players, I think. They're not playing very good, and it's becoming a real problem for Mizzou.
So my question with Missouri is, if you go 10-2, you don't make the SEC championship game. Is that enough? Like, okay, so say you lose on the road at Alabama, but you're able to beat Oklahoma, you beat South Carolina, Mississippi State, and Arkansas. Your best win on the season
But
is
you beat
probably
up.
your best win on the season is probably Oklahoma, who I personally do not think will be a top 25 team. What's their best win of the season?
No, they probably have to win out for sure. I look at it
Yeah,
like because if they don't win
agreed.
out, then Alabama's over them, and I think Georgia. Like there's a lot of Texas. Like they're not going to be in it, but I think they have a real shot to win out. I think it's a good enough team. I think they really only have to beat Alabama. I don't think any of these other teams are unbeatable for them. As much as I look at Arkansas now, maybe that will be a real problem, but I think Mizzou has the firepower for one of those real outsiders looking in right now to do it. And I look at these other teams, aside from that, like top 8, top 10, if you will, from the Power 4 schools.
Well,
I don't love these other teams. I just don't think they have the guys.
my question is, do you even love the top? Like, you're talking
Oh,
about the top 10
I
of
do think
Tennessee.
like when we did that demarcation, I think there's pretty clear. After Notre Dame, I feel like it starts to get like, oh, I have some very.
Yeah, 100% agree. But even those teams like Alabama's got question marks on defense. You look at Tennessee, you got question marks about Nico. Like there are a lot of teams that have some question marks, and
Yeah,
that's
but
going
they
to
don't
be
have like LSU's defense question marks where it's like, oh, they just don't even have the talent.
yeah.
Like,
Well,
Alabama's defense, I think theoretically can play good football at times. Again, first year defensive coordinator, I feel like people aren't giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I'm not sure maybe Alabama doesn't deserve it, but everyone else gets a little bit of grace with their first year D coordinators. I feel like everyone's just jumping on Alabama right
question
away.
for you: if Missouri does, you say Missouri drops at Alabama, they go 10-2. Are they in the conversation?
No, of
You
course
don't
not.
think they
You
don't have
can't
enough?
get pounded. You can't get
Yeah.
pounded like that. And also like Alabama, I'm not
I
sure that
think it's less about getting pounded, but it's like if you don't beat Alabama on the road, like where's your best win? You're talking about the best win being at home against Oklahoma, a team that I don't think is great. And I think they're going to struggle in SEC play with how that offensive line's playing. Well, I mean, it's going to be with the 12 teams, Dill, and especially with some of the parity that you're seeing and that we just saw. Uh, it's going to be a wild conversation. We're going to start having a lot of conversations about this. Would love to hear from you guys in the comment section. I know it's going to get heated. I can tell we're going to have multiple Florida State-esque conversations circa 2023 in this season. So it's going to be heated. The emotions are going to be high. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.